Good morning. Welcome to the second Sunday of Lent. Only 3 more Sundays to go. And then, of course, Palm Sunday, Holy Week, and Easter. We do hope you'll join us for all those services. We have so many good things in store for you. As always, today it just means so much to us that you've chosen to be with us. Thank you. Well, at the end of the song we just heard, the last verse said, I woke up this morning and I was surprised by what I saw. 100 billion bottles washed up on the shore. It seems that I am not alone and feeling all alone. 100 billion castaways looking for our home. Although the writer of that song is not a social scientist, I don't know that anyone has done a better job of capturing one of the defining characteristics of our age, and that is that a great many of us are very lonely. The latest statistics that I have seen are that fully 47% of adults are lonely. That means that 1 out of every 2 people, think about that a second, 1 out of every 2 people, every other person we meet struggles with loneliness. Let that sink in. The group that is most lonely of all, and this may surprise you, are actually people between the ages of 18 and 25. Fully 61% of people between the ages of 18 and 25 report that they are struggling with loneliness. One of the studies that has always fascinated me is a longitudinal study done over the decades. It asks a series of questions. One of those questions is, how many people are there in your life on whom you can completely depend, who you can trust with anything and everything, tell anything and everything, know that they'll always be there for you? In fact, you might just, if you're feeling bold, type what you think the answer to that is into the comments on Facebook or YouTube. When asked how many people are there in your life that on whom you completely depend, you can tell them anything and everything, you know that they'll always and everywhere be there for you. How many people like that do you have in your life? What do you think the most common answer today is? In years past, up to about 3 decades ago, the most common answer was 3, a healthy answer. But about that point, the answer began to decline. And today, the answer is 0. When asked how many people are there in your life on whom you can depend, who you can tell anyone, anything and everything, who you know will always be there, the most common answer today is none. Well, what I want to suggest this morning is that loneliness and suffering are deeply linked. And so in talking about suffering this morning, which is what we're going to talk about, I think we're also going to be able to address loneliness. And the reason for that is that we live in a culture that tells us a particular story about suffering. And that story attaches a stigma to suffering. And so it makes us something shameful. And when we're suffering, then we feel ashamed. And when we feel ashamed, we feel a need to turn away from other people and to hide ourselves from them, to cut ourselves off from them. And that makes us feel lonely. So what is this story that our culture tells us about suffering? Well, we live in a day and age, and again, there are just hundreds and hundreds of studies that bear this out, that the number one value of people in our day and age is simply happiness. When asked what people want most out of life, the most common answer, far and above, far and beyond all the other answers, is people simply want to be happy. At the turn of the century, somewhere in the early 2000s, there were maybe a dozen books that were being written in a year's time about finding personal happiness. Now, the last few years, there are literally thousands of books written every year about finding personal happiness. Add to that we're all around us, we're flooded with image of happy people who seem to have everything, who seem to have it all together. And when that's not our experience, when we're not always happy, and in fact, when sometimes we even suffer, that makes us feel like there's something wrong with us that's not wrong with everybody else. That we're deficient in some ways that others are not. That we are weak, that we are struggling in a way that other people are not, and because of that, we're pathetic. And that causes us to feel shame and shame causes us to turn away. And so what I wanted to do today is I want to suggest is that we need a better story about suffering, one that frees us from the shame that our culture story attaches to us. And when we can do that, we'll find that our suffering actually draws us together rather than pushing us apart. And it just so happens that Jesus gives us that better story in today's gospel. That story has three components as I see it, and each of those components is in direct contrast to the story that our culture tells us. The first thing that I see that Jesus believes about suffering is that he believes that suffering is a gift, not a curse. Suffering is a gift, not a curse. And the reason that suffering is a gift is it helps us identify what to pay attention to. We have so much stimulation coming into our mind, so much input, so much data. We don't always know what to pay attention to. But suffering has a way of narrowing it all down and bringing focus to what that one thing we need to pay attention to so that we can identify what's going wrong and stop it or correct it before we do irreparable damage. Now, we all know this. If I'm hammering a nail and if I miss that nail and hit my thumb, maybe when I was hammering mindlessly. Maybe I was singing a song to myself or going through the day's events, routines. Well, that pain, that suffering in that moment, that calls my mind to what I need to pay attention to. Everything else goes out of my mind. My attention is focused right here so that I can identify what's going wrong and either stop it or correct it before I do irreparable damage to my poor little thumb, so that I still have a thumb. It's the same thing in the moral and relational world. Pain felt there is what we call guilt. Now, many people think that guilt is a negative thing. Guilt is not. Guilt is actually a very positive dynamic. The negative thing is shame. Shame makes us feel like we are bad. And then when we feel like we are bad, we have to hide. But guilt says we do bad things. Shame says I'm a bad person. Guilt says I'm a good person, but I do bad things. Bad people do bad things. So if I'm a bad person, I'm just going to keep doing the things I'm ashamed of. But if I'm a good person doing good things, doing bad things, good people correct the bad things they're doing. So guilt, again, has a way of calling our attention to what's going wrong so that we can correct it before we do irreparable damage to our relationships and to ourselves. In the spiritual world, we feel pain in a number of ways, but one of the ways we feel spiritual pain is in a sort of inner emptiness that really can cause people great suffering. And that suffering is seeking to get our attention so that we don't give our one and only life to things that in the end just don't matter. And so Jesus knows this, and Jesus is brilliant in this because Jesus doesn't numb himself to pain. He doesn't distract himself from pain. He doesn't deny pain. He never loses sight of the goodness of the world or of the goodness of God and the people that God has created. But at the same time, Jesus also, and it's this tension, Jesus can do this, but at the same time, Jesus never flinches in looking at the brutal facts of our current reality. Again, he doesn't deny, distract, or numb himself to pain. He faces the brutal facts about our current reality and allows the pain of doing that to direct his attention to what's gone wrong. And because that's a gift, he's not ashamed of it. He doesn't need to hide. He can say right out in front of God and everybody, the Son of Man must suffer. And so he's not ashamed of it. He's not embarrassed by it. But instead, he talks about it. And when we do that, then what we can do, when we see our pain as a gift, and rather than having to be embarrassed by or ashamed of it so that we somehow want to deny it, avoid it, distract ourselves from it, numb ourselves to it, then we can begin to move on from the pain of having problems. We can move on from the pain of having problems to the suffering that comes in doing something about our problems. And that, my friends, is progress. And progress feels good. So this leads us to the second thing that Jesus believes about suffering, and that is that when we trade in the pain of having problems for the suffering that comes in doing something about the problems, our problems, or what's wrong in the world, that's actually an indication that we're getting life right, not that we're doing something wrong. Now that's counterintuitive. Peter struggles with this. That's why when Jesus says, I got to go suffer, and Peter says, oh my goodness, brother, you got that wrong. You've been out in the sun too long. The other day when they were throwing rocks at us, did one of those hit you in the head? Because suffering's something we avoid, Jesus. It's a bad thing. People don't just walk into suffering. And Jesus replies as strongly to Peter as he replies to anybody. Get thee behind me, Satan. You're thinking like a human being, not like God. Because what Jesus knows is that when he goes to Jerusalem, when he suffers in all the ways that he describes, that is going to be the sure and certain indication that he's doing what God is calling him to do. That suffering is an indication that he has not only beheld the problems in the world, but that he is doing something about those problems. That he is broken with the status quo, that he is not serving the establishment, that he is not simply perpetuating what has always been, but is creating what is yet to be. That kind of change always involves suffering, and that kind of change and that kind of suffering is always a good thing. Now, let me tell you just a little bit about how I've experienced that recently, and it's through the writings of a woman by the name of Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is a black woman, but I have never read anybody who speaks so compassionately and with such understanding about my experience as a white man. And what she has helped me to see is some of the problems that have come in my way of being a man in the world. And she's also helped me admit to myself much of the misery that I have felt in being unwilling both to see or do anything about those problems. And so reading her books are very painful for me. I suffer reading those books. I truly do. But in the gift that she gives me of identifying some of the things I'm doing wrong, she also shows me ways I can begin to correct those things, trade in the misery that comes in having those problems for the suffering that comes in doing something about those problems. And as I begin to do something about them, then I can begin to make progress, to move forward, to reap the benefit of the progress that I'm making in my relationships, particularly in my relationship with my wife and with my daughters. And see, when the suffering that comes in just having problems, I experience that as a burden. I expect you too. And when we carry burdens, when I carry burdens, one of the ways that I've learned about being a man is I carry burdens so other people don't have to. And so if I'm carrying this burden, and I carry a lot of burdens, I'm never even going to talk of them to you, because the second I speak of them to you, then you're carrying that burden too. And I carry this burden so you don't have to. But this is such a lonely place to be. And the truth of the matter is, you know something's going on with me. So you're carrying a burden anyhow. So this is really sort of a selfish decision as well. If I can share a little bit of that with you, then you can care for me, and together we can move ahead, and we both end up in a better place. And so instead of experiencing these things as a burden in which I have to protect myself from you so you're not burdened, where I feel like I'm burdening you too, now the joy that comes in making progress is something I want to share, and it draws us together rather than pushing us apart. And by the way, one of the greatest burdens we carry is that we become burdensome even to ourselves. And that is a really lonely place to be. But if we can again trade in the suffering that comes in having problems for the suffering of beginning, even in the smallest ways, doing something about those problems, that will let us, even if it's the babyest steps, that will enable us to begin to do the work that God has given us to do, and to lay those burdens down, and to be able to relate to other people rather than to have to hide from them. Well, the final thing is, the final component of Jesus' story is that suffering doesn't make us strange, it just makes us human. And that's why Jesus says that the Son of Man has to suffer, greatly. He doesn't just have to suffer, he has to suffer greatly. And that's a little bit ambiguous. Does that mean he's going to suffer in huge ways, or is he going to suffer a lot? And likely it means both. He's going to suffer in some huge ways, and he's going to suffer a lot. And if that's true of Jesus, that's true of you, and that's true of me. And that's one of the things that we all have in common no matter what. We all suffer. One of the things I say is everybody gets whacked. It's just the truth. I don't care who a person is. I don't care how good their life looks. If you know that person well enough, everybody gets whacked and everybody suffers because of it. It's something we all have in common. And one of the ways I've experienced this recently, and it's really been quite a delight, is through a young woman by the name of Sydney Cummings. And Sydney Cummings is a young woman from West Virginia. She's an elite track athlete, and she has a passion for helping people get fit because they'll live healthier lives. And so she posts workouts online every day for free. And my wife has been doing those workouts for the past several months. And it's made a bigger change. My wife has always been fit, but it's made a bigger change in her level of fitness, and even in some ways her demeanor, than anything else that I've seen her do before. And I have a theory about that. And it comes from, as Linda usually does her workouts at about 5:30 in the morning. I'm usually working by then, doing emails, writing, something like that. And so I'll hear Linda doing her workouts, or I'll hear Sydney leading those workouts. And what I'll hear most predominantly is Sydney going, whoo, or huh, or huh. And so it's not like she's manning up, pretending like she's tough and strong, that she's got this, never let him see you sweat. It's like she's suffering in these workouts right along with the people who are doing them. and she's right in that with Linda. And so, in saying, I'm in this with you. And I think that's authentic, even though she's this elite athlete, because she's still pushing herself in these workouts every day. She's still struggling with them. They still cause her suffering. And she's just being vulnerable about that suffering. And that draws her and Lynn together. And because Sydney is such a source of incredible positivity, that positivity sort of flows into Linda. And when the workouts are done, even though she's tired, it takes a while for her breathing return to normal and parts of her body hurt, she just comes up sort of full of joy. And it's been so fun to watch that Christine, my older daughter, started doing those workouts as well. And I've actually started doing some of them too. What's Sydney's secret? The secret is in the suffering that comes from working out every day. She says, hey, I'm in this with you. We're in this together. Suffering doesn't make you strange. It just makes you human. We don't talk about our suffering, but if we did, we'd realize that is perhaps the single thing we all have in common. What Jesus wants us to know is that he's in this with us, and that we're all in this together, and that together, not alone, we will get through. Amen. Amen.